my remarks with a couple of... I think it's very good and very, very tempting, but also very positive to use historical events and the historical figures as sort of inspiration and a legacy, or as imaginative resources to help us understand our current dilemmas or difficulties. I think we need to be always conscious of ways in which people in the past are different to us as well as similar. And I mean, John's made a couple of points that I think are very important. Firstly, everyone, so far as we know, in the English Revolution believed in the Christian religion. So if you're thinking about radicalism and if you're thinking about women, they believed certainly that people were equal under God in terms of their religious ideas. But they mostly, so far as we can tell, also believed that women were inferior and subordinate to men. Women weren't negligible, and as we'll see, women were very active in the leveller movement. But in the last resort, they did not have a belief that we would have about gender and other sorts of equality. So I want to sort of have that as a sort of framework. What I want to say, first of all, except in terms of current dilemmas, it seems to be one of the main lessons of looking at John Lilburne in relationship to his wife specifically, is that it was not easy to be married to a political activist. And particularly it was not easy to be married to a political activist who was a very important radical figure, but was, perhaps we should say, a rather egotistical political radical. And what the Levellers did actually, which was a very effective political strategy, was that they made their own sufferings and their own activities emblematic of a broader argument, we'd say now, broader narrative about tyranny and oppression. So John Lilburne spent, as John Rees has indicated, spent most of his adult life in prison. He was in prison before 1640 as a circulator and producer of subversive literature, and from the year 1643 to his death as a Quaker, interestingly, in 1657. I don't know the proportion, but certainly more than half of that time he spent in prison. Initially he fought in Parliament's army early on, and he was captured by the Royalists and condemned to death. But after 1645, until his death in 1657, he was mostly imprisoned by his own side, because, as John has indicated, he mostly was in dispute with a parliamentarian cause that he thought had become increasingly tyrannical, had lost sight of what the revolution was about, and particularly on issues like religious liberty, political participation, freedom of the press, that Parliament had become tyrannical. So, being Elizabeth married John Lilburne in 1641, and she outlived him, but we don't know much about her life, or I don't know much about her life after 1660. Most of the time he was in prison, which didn't stop him writing books and circulating literature and so on. So what I'm going to just do in my 20 minutes or 17 minutes left, I'm going to look at three things. I'm going to talk about Elizabeth's life briefly. I'm going to talk more generally about women in the leveller movement. And I'm then going to talk about print, because I think John's remark about the levellers being the English Revolution, probably, there might be an argument about the Dutch Revolt in the 16th century, but the English Revolution is the first revolution to which print is crucial. And it's a bit like the period that we're living through with the internet. It's a new form of political communication. People are becoming more literate, being able to use it. So I want to talk about how male levellers in particular presented women, and Elizabeth Lilburne in particular, in print. But first about Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a radical in her own right. She was a member of a radical Baptist congregation, so like John, she was against a national church, and Baptists and other religious radicals were sort of the basis for the street movements that John has mentioned. But most of the time, her role was a supportive role. John was in prison, so she's always short of money. She's usually pregnant. She had 10 children between 1641 and 1657. John Lilburne died when he was out on bail, going to see his wife after her latest pregnancy and delivery. So prison actually wasn't as bad as, you know, in the modern era, because you could still write books and you could still conceive children. It was a mixed blessing, I think. She is working with him. She's petitioning to get him out of prison. She's circulating his books when he's not there. She's protecting secret presses and sending messages and so on. In the spring of 1643, she successfully mobilised the English Parliament to threaten. John was imprisoned by the Royalists in Oxford and was threatened with execution. And so she persuaded the English Parliament to say if they executed John, they would execute Royalist prisoners. They would, you know, have reprisals. And then, heavily pregnant, she went to Oxford with this order from the English Parliament and got him out of the Royalist prison. In 1645, John Lilburne was imprisoned by the English Parliament for attacking their religious policies and attacking their attempt to crack down on the radical press. She joined him in Newgate and gave birth to a daughter in there. They had a child that was called Tower, as in Brooklyn, you know, sort of. So she was in prison with him. In 1647, she was again arrested for circulating John's scandalous books during his latest imprisonment. One time when she was in prison, their home was searched for dangerous books, and all her preparations for childbirth were taken by the sort of parliamentarian authorities. I'm going to talk about 1649 in a more general way. In 1649, as John has said, the Levellers did not agree with the way that the Republic was set up, and they issued a pamphlet called England's New Chains, saying that a change of bondage, you know, that the people who fought and sacrificed for the revolution weren't getting anything out of the political settlement. And so the Leveller leaders were in prison in 1649, and then John in particular was banished in 1652 for quarrelling with a leading member of the Rump. He returned in June 1643 from the Netherlands and spent rest of his life mostly in and out of prison. So Elizabeth had a hard life, really. She lobbied for his release. She tried to get Cromwell to release him, promised that he would be quiet and thankful, but he was not the sort of person to be quiet and thankful. And as I say, you know, in the end, he died. I can't remember, I should know. How old was he? 15 to 40. You know, he died at 42, having spent most of his life in prison. After his death, and I'm ambiguous about this because she looks like just a sort of compromiser, but after his death, Elizabeth did get a pension for her family from Cromwell. She sorted out various disputes that John had made the most of, I think. And I think it's an interesting thing about how far, you know, the necessity to support a family and the necessity to compromise, you know, how far that's something we'd be critical of, or how far that's something that made his career possible. So much for Elizabeth Lilburne. But Elizabeth Lilburne is one of many women, some whose names we know, some of we don't. I call her Catherine Chidley, but who knows? Elizabeth Lilburne, a woman called Ellen Larner, who was married to one of the main Leveller printers, a woman called Mary Overton, who was married to Richard Overton. But thousands of, people debate it, but certainly scores, hundreds of women, particularly in London, were active in the Leveller movement. They acted as messengers, they acted as petitioners, they protected printing presses. Certainly in the case of Catherine Chidley, who wrote religious pamphlets and is very often and very plausibly credited with writing leveller petitions. The most interesting petitions came in 1649, after the leveller leaders, as I said, were put in the Tower for agitating. Burford tomorrow is obviously part of that agitation, for writing and campaigning against the compromise Republican establishment. And what's interesting, the rhetoric of these petitions, the arguments of these petitions are very interesting, quite complicated in some ways. Also, evidence for specific female organisation. I think it's interesting, specific organisation of apprentices, young men, and also specific organisation by women. Because at the end of this petition, it asked for all women who approved this petition to come and sign it in the particular wards of London, and to meet at a particular day to deliver them to the Parliament. And their arguments include an appeal themselves to history, to biblical history. Deborah and Jael. Deborah's Jael, I think, is the one who hammered the spike through the eye, the head of Sisera, the baddie in the Bible. So she was quite... there's a Northamptonshire minister who called his daughter Jael, which is quite impressive. But I don't know that... and then the Danes, you know, and then the overthrow of episcopal tyranny in Scotland, which began the English Revolution. So they appeal to history. They also appeal to a sort of common religious and political interest. They're claiming, you know, we've got an interest in Christ equal unto men, a proportional share in the freedom of the Commonwealth. They're claiming they're not claiming, and at Putney no one ever said women should have full political rights, but they are claiming a right independently, because when they petitioned Parliament, they were treated rather contemptuously. Some pamphlets say they were told to go away and wash their dishes, to which they say, we've no dishes left to wash. And the other thing they say, we've answered your husbands, we're not answering you. And so they're saying, we're no whit satisfied with the answer you gave unto our husbands. And political rounds. So women...
It's a sign.
Yeah, it is a sign. It's providential. They're claiming, you know, political rights. But I want to end with talking a little bit about how women are presented in the leveller movement in print, because I think some of it is rather contradictory. I think the levellers were a movement, so it encouraged women, it encouraged younger men. But I think it was also a movement that believed, as perhaps we shouldn't expect anything else, believed that politics was, in a formal sense, was a matter for male heads of household. Women were not quiet, completely subordinated, but they were the junior partners in the household. Apprentices were being trained up. So that the women's role was to support the men. And there's lots of stories in Lilburne's writing about Elizabeth Lilburne, most of which are not very complimentary. So she spent all her life trying to get him out of prison. And most of the time in the pamphlet she appears as a sort of weak and feeble woman who's not as committed to the cause as he was. And there's this lovely line, which must have been plausible, must almost have happened, about when they're both being examined by the Parliament. And he said, you know, she says, you know, I told you, you know, no good would come of this, you're going to be betrayed by them, you know, they're not on the public good. And he, in this pamphlet, says, oh, you know, then I told her, you know, nothing would prevent me from being loyal to the cause. So it's a way of presenting his wife as weaker than him, claims to have written her petitions, and, you know, as the weaker vessel. For that end, I drew up a few, you know, etc., etc. And it's sort of true and not true, it seems to me, but it has a very interesting thing in terms of the public propaganda, which is of a movement that is inclusive. It includes women, it includes young men, it includes They define themselves often by place as well. It has petitions from London, petitions from Hertfordshire, petitions from Buckinghamshire. But it's a movement that is of its time, of male householders. And even the women's petitions, which have these are slightly contradictory to modern readers. They have these great claims to political activism and political agency, but they also have a claim to being the weaker vessel, and that's quite useful to the level of propaganda, because they say things like, our oppression is so great that even women can understand it. And they also have these great stories about the tyranny of the new republic is emphasised because of their breakup of the households of honest leveller men. So that, you know, they say, would you have us keep quiet when our friends and our husbands are taken from us and by soldiers, you know, fetched out of their beds at night by soldiers to the affrighting of themselves, their wives, children and families. So I think the levellers and women and the position and role of Elizabeth Lilburne specifically is complex. That on the one hand they're the weaker vessels, and that's highlighted in the printed sort of literature. On the other hand, they're claiming an equal share and interest with men in the Commonwealth, and are clearly active and essential to that movement, but within a sense of the man as the leading figure in the household.
Oh, well.